The silence of the house at 3 in the morning was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that pressed in on Simone from all sides. It was different from the quiet of her own small apartment, which was just an absence of noise. Here, in the sprawling, minimalist mansion of Mr. Ishikawa, the quiet was a statement of power, a velvet-gloved hand over the mouth of the city. Every surface gleamed under the recessed lighting of the cavernous kitchen, black granite, brushed steel, polished chrome. It was a sterile, beautiful space that felt more like a laboratory than a place where food was made. Simone's hands, submerged in hot, soapy water, were the only soft things in the room. She worked methodically, her movements economical and practiced, as she scrubbed the last of the delicate porcelain plates from her employer's late-night meeting. Her uniform, a simple light blue dress, and a starched white apron, felt like a costume from another century against the stark modernity of her surroundings. Exhaustion was a dull ache behind her eyes and a deep thrumming in the soles of her feet. She'd been on duty for 16 hours, but when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Tanaka, had asked her to stay late, there was no question of saying no. You didn't say no in this house. You simply complied. The rhythmic clink of ceramic against the basin, the soft rush of water, the squeak of her sponge, these were her only companions. She focused on the task, letting her mind go blessedly blank. Thinking too much was a luxury she couldn't afford here. It was better to be a ghost, a pair of hands that left cleanliness in its wake. He couldn't sleep. The ghosts of the men from his meetings still lingered in the cigar smoke that clung to the air in his study. Words like betrayal, territory, and consequence echoed in his mind, a familiar and weary chorus. Ryu Ishikawa, a man whose name was spoken in whispers across the city's hidden arteries of power, found no peace in the empire he commanded. He left the oppressive silence of his chambers and moved through the darkened halls of his home, his bare feet making no sound on the cold marble floors. He sought only a glass of water, a simple, physical act to ground him in the present moment. But as he neared the kitchen, a soft, rhythmic sound reached him, pulling him forward. He stopped in the doorway, a shadow concealed by shadows. He saw her at the sink.
Simone.
The American girl Mrs. Tanaka had hired a few months ago. He knew her name, as he knew the name of everyone who worked under his roof, but he had never truly seen her before.
Now he did.
The soft, focused light above the sink framed her like a subject in a painting. Her back was to him, the line of her spine straight and taut with fatigue under the pale blue fabric. Her hands moved with a gentle, hypnotic grace in the water. She was washing his dishes. A mundane task, an insignificant detail in the grand, violent tapestry of his life as a powerful Japanese mafia boss. Yet he stood there, motionless, for 1 minute, then 2, then 5. He watched the careful way she stacked a clean plate, the small sigh that escaped her lips, the way a stray curl clung to the damp skin of her neck. In his world, people were loud, obsequious, or terrified. They postured and plotted. She was quiet. She was simply doing her job, unaware of his scrutiny, existing in her own small bubble of soapy water and porcelain. And for reasons he could not begin to articulate, the sight of her was the first moment of peace he had felt all night. The fine hairs on Simone's arms prickled. It was a primal, inexplicable feeling, the sensation of being watched. The air in the kitchen had shifted, grown heavier, colder. She slowly lifted her hands from the water, letting them drip into the sink, and turned. He was there, standing in the archway that led to the main hall, a tall silhouette against the deeper darkness behind him. He wore simple black silk pants and a loose white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. Even in the dim light, his presence was absolute, a gravitational force that bent the room around him. Simone's heart gave a single, hard thud against her ribs, but her expression remained neutral. She had perfected the art of the impassive face. It was a necessary shield. She simply inclined her head slightly. Mr. Ishikawa, her voice was quiet but steady. He moved from the doorway, his steps silent. He didn't turn on the main lights, preferring the intimate glow from above the sink. He stopped near the central island, the expanse of black granite a stark no-man's land between them. His eyes, dark and unreadable, assessed her. She could feel his gaze tracing the lines of her worn-out uniform, her damp hands, her tired face. "It is late," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and measured, with an accent that was more a cadence than a mispronunciation. "Yes, sir," she replied. There were a few things left to finish. He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. He seemed to be looking for something, a crack in her composure, a flicker of the fear that usually greeted him. But Simone offered him nothing but polite, professional stillness. He walked to the high-end refrigerator, its stainless steel door reflecting a distorted version of the room. He retrieved a bottle of water, opened it, and drank. The small sounds, the twist of the cap, the water being swallowed, were unnervingly loud in the quiet. He didn't speak again. He just finished his water, placed the empty bottle precisely in the recycling bin, and walked back toward the doorway. Just before he disappeared into the hall, he paused. "Good night, Simone." The sound of her name in his voice was a strange, unsettling thing. It made her feel seen, and in this house, being seen was dangerous. Ryu returned to his suite, but the image of her was seared into his mind. The quiet industry, the graceful fatigue, the utter lack of artifice. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sleeping city, a glittering expanse of jewels he owned a significant piece of. His life was a series of calculated risks, violent negotiations, and the constant, crushing weight of leadership. He was the head of the Ishikawa Gumi, a title inherited through blood and cemented with his own. He was a mafia boss, a predator in a world of predators. He dealt in fear because it was the only currency with any real value. His lieutenants, his rivals, even the politicians on his payroll, they all looked at him with a carefully curated mixture of respect and terror. They saw the legend, the power, the threat. They never saw the man. But she had.
Simone.
She had looked at him not as a monster or a king, but as her employer who had appeared in the kitchen at an unreasonable hour. There was no flattery in her eyes, no pleading, no fear-laced deference. There was only a calm, guarded professionalism. It was both unnerving and intoxicating. He ran a hand through his dark hair, silver threads catching the moonlight. He thought of the men he had met with earlier, their greedy eyes and false smiles. He thought of the constant threats simmering just beneath the surface of his ordered world. Then he thought of her, her hands in the warm water, bringing order to a small corner of his home. It was a purity of purpose he had not encountered since he was a boy, long before the world had stained him. He began to watch for her. Not overtly, but he found his internal clock adjusting. He would take a later meeting, walk a different route through the house, all on the chance of seeing her. A glimpse of a light blue dress disappearing around a corner. The faint, clean scent of lemon polish in a room she had just left. These small, insignificant moments became anchors in his turbulent days. He was a man who collected rare art, vintage cars, and powerful secrets. Now, he found himself collecting moments of a quiet maid, and it was a collection that was fast becoming his most prized. The atmosphere in the mansion grew subtly charged in the following weeks. Simone felt it as a low hum beneath the surface of her daily routine. Mr. Ishikawa's presence, once a rare and formidable event, became a quiet constant. She would be dusting the books in the library, and he would enter to select a volume, his movement silent, his proximity making the air crackle. She would be polishing the long dining table, and he would pass through the room, his dark eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. He never said more than a few polite words, but the weight of his unspoken attention was immense. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the particular scent of sandalwood and cedar that announced his approach. She felt his gaze on the back of her neck when she thought she was alone. It was a nerve-wracking intimacy, a connection forged in silence and stolen glances. One afternoon, Mrs. Tanaka found her cleaning the windows in the West Wing. The older woman, whose face was a mask of disciplined efficiency, paused and adjusted a fold in Simone's apron. "The master has taken notice of your work," Mrs. Tanaka said, her voice low and devoid of inflection. It was not a compliment. It was a warning. You are diligent. You are quiet. This is good. But do not forget your place, Simone-san. A field mouse that catches the eye of the eagle does not live long. Simone's hands stilled on the glass. I am only doing my job, Tanaka-san. Mrs. Tanaka's gaze was sharp. Precisely. Do nothing more. Do nothing less. Be invisible, but it was too late for that. Simone knew she was no longer invisible to him, and a reckless, dangerous part of her was more curious than afraid. She found herself watching him, too. She saw the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed his sharp features, the deep loneliness in his eyes where he stared out at the city from his balcony. She saw the man beneath the fearsome reputation of the Mafia boss, and that was the most perilous thing of all. The attack came without warning. It was a Tuesday evening just after 9. A violent shattering of the mansion's curated peace. The sound of splintering wood as the front doors were breached was followed by the unmistakable, percussive roar of gunfire. It was not the chaotic spray of street thugs. It was controlled, strategic, and utterly terrifying. Simone, who had been collecting laundry from the upstairs linen closet, dropped the basket and froze. Her training, the carefully worded instructions from Mrs. Tanaka for just such an event, kicked in. She ran, not for an exit, but for the nearest secure room, a small, windowless pantry at the end of the hall. She locked the heavy door behind her and plunged the room into darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sounds of the fight were muffled but still horrifying. Shouts in Japanese, the thud of bodies, the sickening crack of breaking bones, more gunfire. She pressed herself into the corner, surrounded by the scent of starched linens and cedar blocks, and made herself as small as possible. She clutched a heavy-duty broom handle she'd grabbed on instinct, its smooth wood a pathetic, useless weapon against the violence unfolding outside. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise subsided, replaced by a tense, ringing silence. Footsteps pounded down the hall, heavy and urgent. They stopped outside her door. Someone tried the handle. Simone. The voice was deep, strained, and instantly recognizable. It was him, Ryu. She fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling so badly it took 2 tries to turn it. The door swung open. He stood there, flanked by 2 of his men, their dark suits immaculate despite the chaos. But he was not. His white shirt was splattered with blood, not his own, she prayed, and a fresh, angry cut bled freely on his high cheekbone. His face, usually a mask of cold control, was a canvas of raw, primal fury. His eyes, however, were fixed only on her. They scanned her from head to toe, a frantic search for injury. The sheer force of his concern was a physical blow. He saw the broom clutched in her hand, and something in his expression fractured, a flicker of profound, unexpected emotion. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of his world came crashing down around them. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled activity. Men with grim faces moved through the mansion, their voices low and urgent as they assessed the damage, secured the perimeter, and dealt with the consequences of the failed assault. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Simone remained in the hallway, rooted to the spot, the useless broom still in her hand. Her mind struggled to process the swift, brutal violence that had invaded her predictable world of cleaning schedules and polishing cloths. The professional distance she had so carefully maintained was gone, shattered along with the front doors. Ryu dismissed his men with a sharp gesture. They were alone. He took a step toward her, and then another, until he was standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. His touch was shockingly soft for a man whose hands were instruments of power. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. It was the question his eyes had already screamed. She could only shake her head, the motion small and jerky. Words failed her. She looked at the cut on his face, the blood matting the dark hair at his temple. Without thinking, she lifted a hand, her fingers tracing the air just beside the wound. "You are," she breathed. He seemed not to have even noticed. Her small gesture, that instinctive reach toward him, seemed to disarm him completely. The last vestiges of the formidable Mafia boss, the cold leader of the Ishikawa-gumi, fell away. In his eyes, she saw a stark, terrifying vulnerability that mirrored her own. "It's nothing," he said, but his gaze held hers, intense and searching. The space between them hummed with everything they had never said, a dangerous current of unspoken feeling that was now, in the wake of violence, impossible to ignore. The barrier between employer and employee, between his world and hers, had been irrevocably breached. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to send her away. The attack was a message, a brutal reminder that his life was a constant war. He had built this fortress not just to protect himself, but to contain the darkness that surrounded him. She did not belong here. Her quiet light was an anomaly, a thing to be cherished and protected, and his world would only extinguish it. The logical, responsible course of action was clear. He would give her a sum of money that would change her life, arrange for her safe passage back to America or anywhere else she wanted to go, and erase her from his life to keep her safe. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing to do. The thought was like a physical agony, a fist closing around his heart. For years, he had cultivated an existence of absolute control, of emotional detachment. Attachments were weaknesses, liabilities to be exploited by his enemies. He had lived by that code, bled for it. But Simone, she wasn't a liability. She was the only real thing in his gilded cage. The thought of this house without her, without the possibility of seeing her moving quietly through the halls, without her scent on the clean linens, without the steady, grounding presence of her existence, was desolate. It was a future as sterile and empty as the mansion's architecture. He had spent his entire adult life as a powerful Japanese mafia boss, a man who took what he wanted, who eliminated threats, who bent the world to his will. Now, the greatest threat to his own heart was a 21-year-old maid in a pale blue dress. He looked at her, still standing there, so fragile and yet so resilient, and he understood. Sending her away wasn't an act of protection. It was an act of cowardice. It was an admission that he was too weak to protect what he valued most. And Ryu Ishikawa was not a weak man. He made a decision then, one that violated every rule he lived by, a choice so reckless and insane it felt like the only sane thing he had ever done. The following evening, the mansion was restored to its immaculate state, but the silence was different. It was heavier, coiled with tension. Ryu had summoned his top lieutenants to the formal meeting room. 10 men, the core of his organization, sat around a long, polished obsidian table. They were hard men, their faces etched with the stories of battles won and loyalties proven. They wore their dark, expensive suits like armor. They believed they were there to discuss retaliation, to plan the bloody retribution that was sure to follow the previous night's attack. Mrs. Tanaka stood stiffly by the wall, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable. Simone had been working in the kitchens, her nerves frayed, her mind replaying the terrifying moments over and over. A junior member of the household staff had appeared and, with a nervous bow, told her she was wanted. "The master requests your presence." In the main meeting room, confusion warred with a fresh wave of fear. She smoothed her clean apron over her light blue dress, her hands not quite steady, and followed him. When she entered the room, 10 pairs of cold, hostile eyes turned to her. The air was thick with smoke, masculinity, and silent condemnation. She felt like a lamb in a den of wolves. She stood by the door, her gaze fixed on the floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a maid. She did not belong here. This was a violation of the house's rigid, unspoken caste system. Ryu, seated at the head of the table, rose. He ignored the questioning, disapproving looks from his men. His eyes found Simone and held her fast, creating a silent tunnel between them that blocked out the rest of the room. He walked toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. The room was so quiet she could hear the soft whisper of his silk shirt. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He looked down at her, at the fear and confusion warring in her wide, beautiful eyes. The disapproval of his men was a palpable force in the room, a wave of judgment beating against him. They saw a maid, a foreigner, an inexplicable and dangerous distraction. He saw his anchor. He saw the woman who had faced his violent world with a broom handle and an unbroken spirit. He saw his future. He reached up and slowly, deliberately, began to unbutton the cuff of his shirt. His lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances. This was a breach of all protocol. Their leader, the formidable head of the Ishikawa Gumi, was a man of impenetrable composure. This was something else entirely. Ryu ignored them. His world had narrowed to the small, trembling woman in front of him. He turned his attention to his left hand, to the heavy platinum ring set with a single, flawless black diamond that rested on his little finger. It was his family's crest, the symbol of his authority, an object that commanded more respect than any weapon. With a slight twist, he slid it from his finger. He held it in his palm for a moment, the metal cool against his skin. Then, he gently took her left hand. It was smaller than his, the skin soft but the fingers calloused from work. She flinched but did not pull away. He looked from the ring in his palm to her eyes, ensuring she understood the gravity of the moment. He spoke, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent, watchful room. "This house is not a safe place for you," he began, the admission a crack in his armor. "My world will always have shadows, and they will always try to touch you." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "The only way I can guarantee your safety, the only way I can keep you from harm, is to bind you to me. To make you untouchable." He lifted her hand and, as his men watched in stunned disbelief, he slid the heavy, masculine ring onto her fourth finger. It was far too large, circling the digit loosely, a stark and beautiful declaration. He kept hold of her hand, the ring a brand of his intention. "You will be my wife, Simone." It was not a proposal.
It was a vow.
A command. A plea. He was the most feared mafia boss in Tokyo, and he was on his knees, metaphorically, before his maid, offering her the only thing he truly owned, his name, his protection, his entire world. He saw the tears well in her eyes, a mixture of terror and a dawning, fragile hope. And in that moment of absolute insanity, Ryu Ishikawa had never felt more powerful.